Hi, good morning. I'd like to welcome you to our second installment in this summer's Resident Grand Round series. Before we get started, a few quick announcements about events just on the horizon. On July 14th, we'll be joined by Dr. George Macari, director of the DeWitt Wallace Institute for the History of Psychiatry, who will be sharing his talk titled Soul Machine, the Invention of the Modern Mind. On July 21st, the Psychiatry Residents Association and its co-presidents Myra Mathis and Joe Taylor have organized this year's vertical integration at the Yale Art Gallery. This is an annual opportunity for residents to come together across training years and is sure to be a fun occasion, it always is. On the 28th of July, in collaboration with the National Neuroscience Curriculum Initiative, several residents will present cutting-edge developments in neuroscience as part of our This Stuff is Really Cool series. Note that this will not be in the CMHC auditorium where we usually do grand rounds. It's going to be in the TAC auditorium right across from Blue State Coffee. So more to come on that in the very near future. And now it is a great honor to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Christine Montross is an associate professor of psychiatry and human behavior at the Warren Alpert Medical School of Brown University. She completed both medical school and residency at Brown, where she received the Martin B. Keller Outstanding Psychiatry Resident Award. In addition to her MD, she also holds a Master of Fine Arts in Poetry from the University of Michigan. Her writings and their accolades are impressive, beginning with her first book, Body of Work, having been recognized as an editor's choice by the New York Times. And this was shortly followed by Falling into the Fire, a psychiatrist's encounters with the mind in crisis. Other writings from Dr. Montross can be found in the New England Journal of Medicine, the New York Times, and Washington Post Book World. A 2015 Guggenheim Fellow in Nonfiction, Dr. Montross is also the recipient of the 2009 Eugene and Marilyn Glick Emerging Indiana Authors Award and was named a 2010 McCall Johnson Fellow in Poetry. I had the good fortune of first meeting Dr. Montross back in my intern year. She was, as she is again today, so kind to facilitate a writer's workshop for our residents. I was on the internal medicine wards at the time, and I still remember the distinct beep of my pager that cut our time together so short that day. She was a keynote speaker for our Residence Day event at the Yale Art Gallery, which brought together residents from Yale, IOL, and UConn. And I'll never forget this. She took a red-eye flight all the way from California to be a part of that day with us. Just another example of how dedicated she is in fostering residents' passion for the arts. I'm happy to say that although she may call Brown home, she will always be a part of our Yale Psychiatry family. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Christine Montross.
Hello, thank you for that kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here on this rainy Friday morning. I'm going to talk today about the evolution of my writing career from studying poetry to writing about anatomy and psychiatry, and now to writing about mental illness in the criminal justice system. I love to do talks like a literary salon, so I'll talk a little and read a little, and then we'll save time for questions at the end and discussion, which is always my favorite part, so I'm looking forward to that today. Certainly would like to thank Chad and the residents for this invitation. It's a particular honor to be asked here by trainees, and I'm definitely grateful for that. Would also like to thank Chad for the idea for the topic of this talk. I think, like most of you, I get into the mode of giving talks on the current work that I'm doing, and Chad had the idea to talk more broadly about the trajectory of my writing, and it was really fun to think about the common ground and through lines in my writing projects. But I will say the idea of a retrospective look and discussion of my career as something which has already had several discrete stages made me feel a little older than I like to think of myself as being, so a little bit of reflection on that for myself as well. Also would like to thank the Division of Law and Psychiatry here at Yale. When I told my very dear friend Lexi Westfall that I was taking on the topic of mental illness in the criminal justice system, but I felt unsure as to how to best approach this intellectual terrain, that was new and somewhat foreign to me, he quickly invited me to join the rich conversations that were happening at law and psychiatry. And Howard Zanana and the rest of the faculty welcomed me warmly, and my friend Reena Kapoor and others have led me toward resources, tolerated incessant questions from me about their work, and even fed me homemade baked goods in the process. So I'm truly grateful for the division's openness and generosity. And in fact, one of the pieces that I'll be reading today emerged from a trip to a correctional facility here in Connecticut that I visited with Yale's Forensic Fellows a year or two ago. I'm excited to talk, especially with trainees, about writing, because I like to say to medical students that we admit all of these incredibly interesting people to medical school, and then we beat the interesting out of them over the course of their medical education. So I love working with and talking with trainees about ways to reconnect with those interesting parts of yourself. So I'm excited to talk about that today. I have always been a writer. I wrote a poem in elementary school that my otherwise very supportive mother accused me of plagiarizing. I wrote a novel in 7th grade. It was not a good novel. Anyone who has ever been in an introductory level creative writing class knows that one of the first mantras to the craft is to write what you know, right? Write from your experience. I was a 12-year-old white girl in the comfortably middle-class suburbs of Indianapolis, and I decided to write a novel in first person from the perspective of a middle-aged black man in the Great Depression. You can see why it was not a successful project. Nonetheless, I stuck with writing and I learned a lot, and the truth is that I always, for as long as I can remember, have used writing to help make sense of the world. So I was a poet before I was a medical student, and people ask me a lot about the connections between poetry and medicine and writing and medicine, and I think that they are many. And in fact, when Lexi and I were in medical school together and dissecting cadavers, he would often run in with a Mary Oliver poem to show me, and we found so many connections between those things. But I think poetry and writing teach you to look at small things and draw larger conclusions from them. And that's really very much what we do in medicine when we look at symptoms and signs and draw larger diagnostic conclusions from them as well. So in one of the wonderful Zen lessons of my life when I was a poet going into medical school, I feared that medicine was going to mean that I would have to give up writing. I'd been teaching university and high school classes to support myself as a poet, and the night before starting medical school, I remember feeling fear mixed with a kind of anticipatory grief. A worry that I was betraying my commitment to writing, that I was losing my chance to be a writer. There's a Buddhist story that I always get wrong, but the essence, at least in the way that I've come to tell it, is that a young man and his father were sitting outside their home when a horse ran up and stopped in front of them. The young man was elated by their luck. Here was a gift from the heavens. "Not so fast," said his father. And in fact, the young man rode the horse and was thrown, and he broke his leg badly. He complained to his father about his bad luck. "Not so fast," said the father. Because the young man had and indeed war broke out, and all healthy young men were drafted, and many were killed. Because the young man had an injured leg, his life was spared. You see where this is going. And the same was true for me. I thought that beginning medical school would mean that I was running the risk of giving up writing, and then I entered into the anatomy lab and was asked to touch and cut open a dead body, and of course, I had to write about that experience to make sense of it. So it began this way. Share just the very beginning of what became Body of Work, my book about dissecting a human cadaver. The syllabus says, Week 1, 5 p.m., pick up bone boxes. The anatomy lab is empty, and yet it's just 18 hours or so before our class. The cadavers have been prepared for months, if not longer, and as we will learn early in the term, their formalin embalming would permit them to sit at room temperature for as many as 20 years without the slightest trace of rot. They could be lying here awaiting our morning dissection, but the faculty is administering this intimacy with death in small doses. The absence of dissecting tables and bodies allows us to resume our social banter, to continue to introduce ourselves to one another before we undertake our strange new trade in the morning. Our talk is frivolous, but I'm aware that this moment is the real beginning of what will be 4 grueling years of work and study. My partner Deborah and I moved across the country for this day. Not only have I never been to Rhode Island, I said in a moment of uncertainty after the decision had been made, I don't even know anyone who's ever been to Rhode Island. And yet, here I am with my new classmates in an otherwise empty human anatomy lab. We form a line, pose for Polaroid photographs that will help the professors associate our names with our faces. After the pictures, we each pick up a wooden-handled box a little larger than a briefcase. The box has my name imprinted on a label by the handle. It is the kind of box that in an academic community like ours would be assumed to hold a telescope or microscope or collection of fragile documents. It will hardly be noticed, I discover, as I walk down the main drag of campus past the falafel joint, the copy shop, and the Starbucks, carrying 2/3 of a human skeleton. The box bumps against my leg as I take it to my car. During the entire walk, I am thinking, this used to be a person. I am carrying parts of a person in this box, and no one knows it. On the street, girls compliment one another's shoes, and a man in his 20s sings Dylan on the curb for quarters. When I reach the trunk, I hesitate for a minute and wonder if I should put the box on the seat beside me instead, and then I decide I'm being ridiculous. I do not look at the box again until I have been home for over an hour, have unpacked my weighty new books and arranged them on my shelves. I do not look until there seems nothing left to do but unfasten the clasps and lift the lid. Inside is a whole skull, at once eerie and beautiful. On close inspection, the individual bones of the skull are visible, and their lines are fluid and lovely. The winging curl of the zygomatic bone that can be traced from the cheekbone to the ear, the bony hinge of jaw, the whorled external acoustic meatus through which sounds travel to our brains. The lower jaw is held in place by small wire springs and screws and can therefore be carefully opened and closed. The top of the skull has been sawed off and reattached with removable fasteners to allow study of the internal cavities and structures of the head. Incomprehensibly, there are 28 bones in the skull alone. I will learn that 14 bones form the face, 6 auditory ossicles, and 8 bones of the cranium, the vault of the brain. The bones join together at irregular lines called sutures, and the look of them is half that of sewn fabric, as the name implies, and half plate tectonics. The ragged and uneven lines imply an ancient and irreversible joining. When I unhinge the top and look inside, the landscape is not the glorified basin I had imagined. It is lunar, with deep pits and sharp protuberances. Symmetrical sets of holes mark tunnels through which nerves and arteries once traveled, carrying signals and sustenance. At the base is the foramen magnum, literally the big hole, where the brainstem and spinal cord emerge from the brain to run down the body. The skull has a full set of teeth, and one of the incisors had been crowned, as I can see from the whittled shape. I think someone kissed this mouth, someone touched this chin in love. I lift from the box one of each of the bones in the arm, humerus, radius, ulna, and one of each of the bones in the leg, femur, tibia, fibula. I hold in my palm the bones of one hand, then the bones of one foot. My skeleton is male, I am sure. The bones and feet and hands are long. If you fit the bones together, you learn the size this man was. At the elbow, the radius and ulna meet the humerus in perfect, well-worn curves and grooves. I hold the 3 bones in place in a straight line, then bend them at the joint. When I do this, I am unnerved and put the bones down on the floor. The movement is utterly human, unquestionably so. I look at them, now separated on my carpet, and think, bones, just bones. I pick them up, join them again, raise the lower arm from where the wrist would be toward the absent shoulder, and they are not bones, they are an arm. The proportions are exact, of course. The movement, something I have never noticed or defined before, but something I innately know. The movement that a human arm makes, the flex, the bend and swing, the slight inward turn toward the body, even when straightened and at rest. Here is what I will learn. The most alarming moments of anatomy are not the bizarre, the unknown. They are the familiar. So I didn't understand it then, but when I took on that first I didn't understand it then when I took on that first project, but I understand it now, that my intention in writing all along about dead bodies, then about mental illness, and now about jails and prisons is to look where people do not wish to look, to direct the gaze towards something from which we are inclined to avert our eyes. Another way of saying this, perhaps, is what David Ross just said to me just before, where he said, "You're like a moth to the flame." So I guess that's it. I work as an inpatient psychiatrist now at Butler Hospital, a freestanding psychiatric hospital that is in many ways a relic of a bygone era in the best possible way. It is a beautiful old building. It was built in the era when it was first thought of as an asylum, and the grounds were designed by Olmsted, the landscape designer famous for Central Park and Golden Gate Park, among others. I work on the intensive treatment units there, and so the patients I see are very psychotic or very manic or actively trying to hurt themselves or other people. I love my job, but in it I see a great deal of suffering. The origins of my writing as a form of advocacy, moving maybe not away from introspection, but to an introspection that also includes a kind of advocacy, emerged from this suffering that I would witness. As the original debates about Obamacare raged, and this is back when it had not yet passed, and now here we find ourselves again, I grew tired of overhearing conversations on the train or on the sidelines of youth soccer games about how providing health care for all would be bad for small businesses or was unnecessary in the first place. I felt an enormous disconnect between these conversations and my own clinical experience, in which patients could not access the treatments that they needed, could not afford their medications, and so ended up in repetitive cycles of crisis after crisis. Maybe if the people on the soccer sidelines and the train could see what I see, I thought, maybe they would think differently. And so my second book, Falling into the Fire, grew out of this desire to help people understand the struggles that our patients endure. I'll read a brief passage from that book that talks both about the desperation of those struggles, but which also speaks to the challenge that I think trainees and all of us have of joining with our patients in those struggles. In this passage, there's a word that I use that really became a thematic through line of this book, and that word is to abide. Prominent neuropsychiatrist, Kurt LaFrance at Brown, who is an expert in non-epileptic seizures, introduced me to the concept of abiding with patients in one's work. He talked about it really as being with patients as they suffer, and I love the Oxford English Dictionary, so when I find a word that intrigues me, I spend some time looking at its origins, and abide dates back to 1120. And the definition of it reads like this incantation or kind of recitation of devotion: to remain with, to hold to, remain true to endure, stand firm or sure, to wait till the end of, hear through, to await defiantly, to face, to encounter, withstand or sustain, to suffer, to bear or undergo. And I love that idea of abiding with patients, but I think it's probably not how people think of their medical care today, to await defiantly with our patients, to suffer or undergo with them. So when you hear me mention abiding in this passage, you'll know that that's the origin of where that came from for me. The poet Theodore Roethke endured episodes of severe depression throughout his life. His poem, In a Dark Time, reads in part, "What's madness but nobility of soul at odds with circumstance, the day's on fire. I know the purity of pure despair, my shadow pinned against a sweating wall. That place among the rocks, is it a cave or winding path? The edge is what I have. As a psychiatrist, I hear the stories my patients tell me, noble souls that they are, and learn how their circumstances are at odds with their lives. They come to me bruised and upended, and when they do, the trajectories of their lives seem to them to be at best uncertain, at worst doomed. If I am to abide with these patients, then I must accompany them to that place among the rocks, to the sweating wall. I must face with them the uncertainty of what lies beyond. I must stand at the edge with them and peer over into the fathomless depths. If I tell my patients, as I do, that this life can be a tolerable one, that they can face their fears and their traumas, their visions and voices, their misery, then I must look at what I am asking them to endure, and I must look at it full in the face. The French philosopher and Christian mystic Simone Weil wrote that to understand affliction, one must accept our total human vulnerability. I may lose at any moment, she wrote, through the play of circumstance over which I have no control, anything whatsoever I possess, including those things which are so intimately mine that I consider them as being myself. Standing on the edge with my patients, abiding with them, means that I must harbor a true awareness that I too could lose my child through the play of circumstance over which I have no control. I could lose my home, my financial security, my safety. I could lose my mind. Any of us could. A wonderful psychotherapist said to me in the wake of my having learned of my mother's breast cancer that we all live beneath a veil of invulnerability. For the most part, we act as if we and our loved ones will live forever, and then there are earth-shaking moments in our lives, a diagnosis, an accident, some unforeseen catastrophe, when the veil is pulled back and we see with clarity that we are all, in fact, perched upon a precipice. Mental illness pierces the veil, and those who suffer from it dwell with their fragility in plain view. My role as a psychiatrist is not to try to repair the veil, but to strengthen my patients so that they can live, so that they can suffer less, so that they can hope. Mary Weatherston is a psychologist who lives in Michigan. She is also a dear friend of mine. More than a decade ago, when I was trying to decide whether to go to medical school to become a psychiatrist, I called her to talk about her practice. I worried, I told her, about what it would be like to deal with my patients' misery day in and day out. In retrospect, I think I was asking her how to abide with the suffering of others. Mary shares my love for northern Michigan and its lakes. Without thinking, she reached to that shared territory for a metaphor. The patients we work with have fallen through the ice in the middle of a frozen lake, she began. My job, your job, should you take this path, is to go out to them, to be with them on the thin ice, and to work to get them out of the frigid water. I listened as she continued, but you must know that if you go out to them on the thin ice, there's a real danger that you will fall in too. So if you go into this work, you've got to be anchored to the shore. You can reach out one hand to the person in the water, she cautioned, but your other hand needs to have a firm grip on the people and things that connect you to the shore. If you don't, you lose the people who are your patients and you lose yourself. Working on the units that I do, I see patients every day who come into contact with the criminal justice system. And I was struck by the fact that my psychiatrically ill patients with very similar behaviors and circumstances, yelling in the Starbucks, causing a disturbance in the community, faced radically different outcomes, depending on whether, when the police are called, they are taken to a hospital or to jail. This struck me as terribly unjust, and it's been wonderful to see the leadership that Madeline Baranowski and others here have taken in targeting those critical moments of decision-making by police. The project itself that I'm taking on now, writing about mental illness in the criminal justice system, has been a wilier one than my 2 prior books. First of all, I was struck by a feeling that I really had to educate myself on the many vast areas of expertise that collide in the criminal justice system: economics, politics, law, sociology, drug policy, urban planning, the history of race and social justice in our country. And then I had a long stage of paralysis as to how to enter the project. My first 2 books had more straightforward structures. Writing about dissection, I marched through the body being dissected and was able to take forays into medical history and the history of anatomy, but really had the through line of the experience of dissecting a cadaver in medical school. And the second book was focused on these encounters with patients, and again allowed me to have forays into the history of psychiatry and new and interesting treatments and the history of our experimental knowledge, but to return back to those clinical encounters as anchors. So I struggled for a long time knowing how to dive into this new project, which has seemed to me and still continues to seem to me very vast. And sometimes when I can't write my way out of a problem, I try to read my way out of a problem. And I read 2 wonderful books, one of which by a faculty member here at Yale. I read Citizen by Claudia Rankine, and I read The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson. Neither of these are psychiatry books. Both of them are exceptional books, so I recommend them highly to you. For those of you who don't know about them, Citizen is a beautiful book in the second person about the experience of race in America. So Claudia Rankine will write things like, you are sitting at a faculty meeting, immediately implicating you in the moment you are sitting in a faculty meeting and someone says, isn't it too bad that with all of these qualified candidates, we have to narrow our search to hire someone of color, right? So you are implicated in that, you are sitting in there. It's a beautiful and breathtaking book. The Argonauts of Maggie Nelson is also a beautiful book in a very different way, but it's about her experience of falling in love with someone whose gender was undetermined to her at the time. She writes about the 2 of them creating a family together and then her partner undergoing a transition from her natal sex to her true sex. And the book is fascinating in the way that, like Citizen, it makes a reader feel like the questions are universal and personal at the same time. So for me, even though I have always felt myself to be female, reading The Argonauts, I started thinking, well, why have I always felt myself to be female? And the questions that seemed to be about this person and trans identity suddenly seemed to be about me and all of us. How do we construct our families? How do we construct our genders? And I think writing about the criminal justice system has at its core this same problem. If we see the people in jails and prison as other, and if we see ourselves as not that, how do we bring universal and personal perspectives to that writing? So I read those books, and that's been helpful. And as I thought about what was so successful in them and aspired to achieve some of that perspective shift that they had achieved, I started thinking about maybe structuring the book project around these thematic concepts like evil and isolation and revenge. Shakespeare has a quote from Henry VI about revenge. Oft have I heard that grief softens the mind and makes it fearful and degenerate. Think therefore on revenge and cease to weep. Revenge has its roots in anger, we know this, but it's cast by Shakespeare as a means of moving beyond grief and avoiding fear. Oft have I heard that grief softens the mind and makes it fearful and degenerate. Think therefore on revenge and cease to weep. Shift away from grief and from fear and toward anger and revenge. It also, by definition, has its roots in harm. And of course, I went back to my OED. Revenge, the act of hurting, harming, or otherwise obtaining satisfaction from someone in return for an injury or wrong suffered at his or her hands. It has harm in its definition, and that is part of the story. We obtain satisfaction by hurting or harming others. We pay for suffering by causing others to suffer. We are angry, and within the criminal justice system, our anger is meted out in sentencing. Sometimes these sentences are extreme. They result in solitary confinement or life in prison. Sometimes they are utterly illogical, as was true for a young man I saw recently who was facing a sentence of 378 years to life, or others I have seen serving, for example, 3 consecutive life sentences. Reminded me of my history of anatomy research where people would be sentenced to death and then dissection, right? That there's a punishment beyond your death that they continue to impose. 3 consecutive life sentences, 378 years to life. These extreme, irrational sentences reflect an extreme emotional response, anger, but also something else, fear. The more time I spend in prisons and around our judicial system, the more I have come to see revenge as a response to vulnerability. We're desperate to protect ourselves and our families. We do everything in our power to minimize risk for us, for our children, for our communities. We would rather than lock up too many people for too long, rather than erring on the other side and letting someone go free who might harm us. As a judge said to me recently, I worry that if I let someone go too soon, he may hurt someone else, and I will have to live with that. And that's also the article the newspapers write. They're not going to write an article on me complaining that I'm too tough on crime. In fact, I've been thinking about incarceration within the framework of number needed to treat. Like, how many tests can we justify in order to catch an early stage of cancer? And how many people do we need to incarcerate in order to prevent the crimes that we fear? We believe that punishment will protect us, will diminish our vulnerability. We worry that the darkness of these people, these actions, will otherwise touch us, that we're vulnerable to their crimes, their criminality. By locking them away, by exiling them, by putting them out of sight, we feel safer, less vulnerable. We feel less mortal, less afraid. It is a form of avoidance. Once they are in the system, locked away, we do not want to think about them, do not want to examine what the conditions are like for them, do not want to analyze whether the sentences they receive are effective or fair. We want them to go away, and we want the solution to be a simple one. Nietzsche famously said, "Beware that when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster, for when you gaze long into the abyss gazes also into you." We do not want to fight Nietzsche's monsters. We do not wish to engage with them, to transform them. We want them to go away. And we do not want to look closely at what happens to them in the places that we send them. We do not want to risk the abyss staring into us. But as I said, moth to a flame, I want my writing to look where people do not wish to look, to the place among the rocks, the sweating wall, into the abyss. So from my new project, I'll now finish with one example of what our revenge looks like. One comment before I start, there's brief profanity in this piece, a quote from a comment that someone made, and I'm actually quite disheartened by the descent to the lowest common denominator that our language and public discourse is experiencing. So I use the word with caution, but I include it both for the accuracy of the quote, but also for the emphasis intended by the person who used it. I visit a high-security prison in Connecticut for 14 to 20-year-old boys. I tour the facility with a group of forensic psychiatry fellows from here at Yale. 3 of the 4 fellows are white. This is easy to notice because as we walk through the hallways of the prison, the only white faces I see are adults. Me, the fellows, some of the staff. All of the kids' faces are black or brown, reads a note I scribble in my journal as I walk down the prison's hall. All of them. There is a yellow line painted on the concrete floor of the prison which divides the hallways in half. One side, the one that we are walking on, is unimpeded. The other is the boys' side, and it is interrupted every so often by a metal detector which, in order to continue walking, they must walk through. They are not permitted to cross the line. Some boys walk alone or in pairs headed to their jobs within the facility or to medical or legal appointments. Some walk in a line from their cell block to the prison schoolrooms. The boys wear baggy, matching tan tops and bottoms, which, in another context, would have been assumed to be scrubs. Visitors provide novelty, and as we pass, they turn their heads to watch us, they crane their necks. One cracks a quiet joke to the kid in line behind him, covers his mouth with his hands, grins, punches his friend playfully on the shoulder. The friend laughs, watching the correctional officer out of the corner of his eye, ready to become stone-faced and naive appearing should the CO turn to spot them. We go into one of the prison housing units, which completely implausibly is called a cottage. It is a long, low-slung concrete building full of cells with a common area in the middle. A jocular guard greets us at the door. We are collectively introduced as psychiatrists from Yale, and he grins broadly. "This is jail, not Yale," he wisecracks. The fellows who are with me crack up laughing. All around us are the dark-skinned faces of teenage boys looking through their cell doors. Their expressions are solemn. They pay attention. "I used to work in an adult facility, maximum," the guard says. "When the inmates would ask us for special favors like books, we would say, 'Where do you think you are, yo? This is jail, not Yale.' 'Oh, man,' says the guard, still chuckling. 'I haven't thought about that for a long time. You all enjoy your visit.' The CO leading us takes us to a cell that is empty so that we can look inside it. The cell is tiny. We have to take turns walking inside because it cannot hold more than 2 of us at once. In the cell is a set of bunk beds, each with a 2-inch thick mattress. There is a small metal toilet, a small window in the metal door, a small amount of room to walk on the side of the bunk bed to the door or the toilet. That's it. From the cottages, we are guided into the library. A young man is in there holding a book, getting ready to leave. He greets us politely, then volunteers that he has spent 4 years here. "It was my first offense," he says, "first and only. I'm not coming back." I wonder what first offense gets you 4 years. I look at him, subtract 4 years from his face as best I can, and think he cannot have been much more than 12 when he began his time here, though I know the prison's youngest inmates are 14, so he must have at least been that old. 14 when he came in, perhaps, and 18 when he leaves. His high school years all spent in prison. Some would hear his comment, "I'm not coming back," as proof that the system works, a shining example of the goal of deterrence having taken root in a once wayward youth. Cynical others would say, "We'll see about that." Others still, "Either way, at what cost?" There is a school area, and in the hallway, the students' work is taped up to the walls. There are pages describing what a stereotype is. There is a paper on Down syndrome. There is an art poster, a photograph of a wooden African mask. Because we are on a tour, we are being taken to see the kind of programming that happens here. It is not nothing. I do not mean to say that it is nothing. But mostly, the visit has been about the good that the prison is doing. Library, school, art poster. I am glad these things are here. I do not doubt their legitimacy. But it has felt disingenuous that we have not really discussed the punishment that happens here, the punishment at the core of why this place exists. We attend a meeting with psychologists, teachers, social workers, correctional officers. We are given a chance to ask questions. What is the most severe punishment that can be leveraged against a boy held in this facility? I ask a psychologist. He can be sent to segregation, she says. For how long? I ask. Up to a year, she says. Now take the developing brain of an adolescent, 14, 15, 16 years old. Put him in seclusion for a year. He touches no one, is touched by no one. He yells out, perhaps, or he stays silent but interacts with no one. His meals are pushed at him through a slot. What must the effect of segregation be on the still developing brain of a child? And a child who presumably has already lacked the foundation for good decision-making, has acted with extraordinary impulsivity, has perhaps enacted terrible trauma, and perhaps also endured terrible trauma. What then? The programming we've seen here, I ask her, the school, the library, the vocational skills, do the kids in segregation get that? In theory, yes, she says, but in practice, it's very hard to arrange. She says they have an hour of recreational time during which they are also isolated from other inmates. One of the fellows in my group asks, do they have televisions in their cells in segregation? Do they have radios? Do they have books? She says there are no electronics. She says sometimes the mental health workers will give them books. I hear in my mind, unbidden. When the inmates would ask for special favors, like books, we would say, where do you think you are, yo? This is jail, not Yale. In the meeting we'd observed, there had just been a school report from some of the prison's teachers. They had run through a number of the boys' names who were struggling in school. Many of them were mentioned as having substantial difficulty reading. Some could not read in English. Some could not read at all. Then what do if they don't have electronics or books, the fellow asks. His question hangs in the air. It is not answered. There is no answer. In this moment, I think about Harry Harlow. In the mid-20th century, Harlow conducted a well-known series of experiments examining the psychological and behavioral consequences of social isolation on primates. The experiments became famous both for their groundbreaking and durable scientific findings, but also for the cruelty of the circumstances to which the animals in the research were subjected. Using monkeys as subjects, Harlow altered experimental variables to look at the consequences of different stressors, durations, and environments of isolation. Over and over again, Harlow brought about destructive effects in the development and behavior of socially isolated monkeys. His findings demonstrated that when young monkeys were socially isolated for 6 months, they suffered devastating and debilitating effects. Monkeys who were isolated twice as long, he found, were almost obliterated socially. The results of Harlow's experiments are relevant here, but perhaps even more relevant is the criticism directed toward his litany of experimentation. The designs of many of his investigations seem born of cruelty, and reading about the methods and the findings is almost too much to stomach. This criticism is not a surprise. More significant is the fact that so many of the critics responded by attacking the premise that the experiments would ever have been necessary in the first place. In her book, Monkey Wars, Deborah Blum describes one such experiment as yielding common sense results that were already well understood, that primates are inherently social animals, and that extreme isolation can damage them in devastating and potentially lasting ways. Similarly, literary critic Wayne C. Booth wrote of the ongoing experiments, Harry Harlow and his colleagues go on torturing their non-human primates decade after decade, invariably proving what we all knew in advance, that social creatures can be destroyed by destroying their social ties. If, in fact, we have all known that in advance, we have not taken it to heart in our carceral policy, or at least we have not been honest in doing so. The policy of placing both children and adults in 23-hour-per-day administrative segregation programs is routinely described as a constructive means of ensuring safety and shaping behavior, not as a method which renders the people within them badly damaged or worse, destroyed. I think about what we know about how the healthy adult mind can be ravaged by isolation. What does it do to a child's mind to be alone in a cell for 23 hours a day? What does it do if this is the case for a year? The American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry has been concerned enough about the answers to those questions that they have issued a policy statement on the solitary confinement of juvenile offenders. The potential psychiatric consequences of prolonged solitary confinement are well recognized and include depression, anxiety, and psychosis, they write. Due to their developmental vulnerability, juvenile offenders are at particular risk of such adverse reactions. Furthermore, they continue, The majority of suicides in juvenile correctional facilities occur when the individual is isolated or in solitary confinement. When we had passed the boys' cells on our tour of the cottages, we passed one cell in which a boy was alone, standing on his toilet, neck craned, stretching his face toward the ceiling and talking out loud at full speed. I said nothing, assuming the boy was mentally ill. After all, I frequently see patients who are actively hallucinating, who are in conversation with visions that no one else can see or voices that no one else can hear. Responding to internal stimuli is the notation I make in the chart to record that my patient remains tethered to these perceptual abnormalities of psychosis. But walking through the prison hallways, we then passed another boy in another cell in the exact same position, doing the exact same thing, at which point I knew my conclusion to be wrong. Though I've seen countless patients in the throes of psychosis, I've never seen the symptoms of mental illness manifest themselves identically in different people. Why are they standing on their toilets? I asked the CO. It's a big problem, he said. They figured out that they can talk to each other through the vents. It's loud in here, and also they get in trouble if they're shouting out their cell doors, so that's the only way they've got to talk to each other. They climb on their toilets to get up near the vents, and then they have whole conversations that way. This is the human pull for connection. The lengths of discomfort and risk and innovation that human beings will go through in order to reach out to another, to hear from another, to be heard by another. The image of it brings to mind the autobiographical words of Richard Wright. I would hurl words into this darkness and wait for an echo, and if an echo sounded, no matter how faintly, I would send other words to tell, to march, to fight, to create a sense of the hunger for life that gnaws in us all. One of the women in the meeting we attended that day was the prison's discharge planner. She said that 1/3 of the adolescents who are discharged from the prison are homeless when they leave. She told a story about a kid she had been preparing for discharge recently. He'd been a real asshole the whole time, she said. He was dismissive of her, dismissive of the idea of planning for his discharge. But when the time came, when he was finally set to go, she said she was getting his things together for him, and he looked up at her and said, "Where am I going to sleep?" She said she didn't know, but she didn't have a place for him to stay. She told us it was winter at the time and that it had been 14 degrees outside that day. He looked up at her and said, "I don't even have a coat, miss." She looked at us and said, even though he had been an asshole, she paused, shook her head. This is where the job is really hard. She began to tear up, stood from the table, and walked quickly out of the room. I finished her sentence in my head. Even though he had been an asshole, he is still a person. He is still a child. I'm going to pause there. So thank you. That was fun to read from new work, and a little, as I'm talking about themes of vulnerability, always a little vulnerable to read from a new project, but I really appreciate your engaged attention. So my hope is now to segue into a period of time where we can begin a discussion, and I'm happy to answer questions about the pieces of writing that I've read from today, the current project or past projects, are also just about, as Chad suggested, this trajectory of a career that has had multiple facets to it, and which yours will as well. So I'd love to open up the conversation for questions at this time.